Wrong career, my friend.
Okay, we're going to start off with a moment of silence for all of the frozen iguanas. Walked out of my house this morning. There were 2 in my front yard. Unbelievable.
What do you do with it?
You take pictures of them and send them to your friends. That's the minig. Okay. The state encourages people to kill iguanas, yes.
Today's the day.
Yes, but it's too easy today. All right. What I'd like to do is break this up into 2 separate discussions, each one a little bit on the shorter end because we don't want too much information at once. This is a famous and fundamental discussion regarding grama on Shabbos and Yontif, and we'll get involved hopefully with many applications, including the famous Starkey Yontif oven, which was created based on many of the ideas we'll be discussing in the sugya. We'll actually see together, hopefully next time, part of the tshuva that was written by Rabbi Heinemann, and then we'll see some of the other tshuvas written by other poskim addressing some of their major concerns and questions on that chiddush of the Starkey. But for today, we'll start off with the background. So we have a Gemara in Shabbos. It's a Mishnah in Shabbos Daf Kuf Chaf that has a machlokis. What do you do when there's a small fire that breaks out on the table? So halacha l'maaseh is if it's a real fire that starts on Shabbos, you put out the fire. It's that simple. No grama, no shinuyim. You put out the fire because the assumption is that any concern of fire spreading is a suffix sakana. We live in neighborhoods where the homes are close together, and if God forbid a fire spreads throughout one's house, even if everyone is out of the house, it could easily spread to your neighbor's house. So any real fire, you put it out. Now there are times where there could be a slight fire, where you have plenty of time to control it, and then maybe this Mishnah could be applied. So the Mishnah says as follows. Rav Shimon ben Nanas was of the opinion, if you have a fire that breaks out on the table, you can place jugs of water around the fire, of kli cheres, of earthenware, and then when the fire gets close enough to the kalim will heat up, they're going to break, and the water will extinguish the fire. And according to most Rishonim, this is true even if the water was not in kalim. You just pour the water around the table. According to most Rishonim, with the exception of the Rif, that would also be permissible. Rabbi Yossi, though, quoted in the Mishnah, argues and says that we don't allow putting out the fire in this non-direct way. And the Mishnah does not elaborate what the machlokas is. That's what the Gemara does. The Gemara goes through a whole discussion. We're going to jump towards the end of Kuf Chaf and Beis, where the maskana of the Gemara is that really both Rav Shimon ben Nanas and Rabbi Yossi agree that min haTorah, doing any malacha b'derech grama, doing any indirect malacha would be mutter. Now generally the definition of grama, when it comes to nezikin, we have a famous Tosas in Bava Basra that speaks about this, is I'm not doing a maisa where there's a direct result of my action, but there's a time delay. A time delay is usually the definition of grama. Right? So just to get our terminology correct, we often speak about psik reisha. So psik reisha means that I'm doing action A, right? I'm dragging the bench on the ground, and it happens to be because it's a heavy bench and it's very soft dirt. I'm making a furrow. I'm in violation of choresh. I'm plowing on Shabbos. So I'm not doing it for that purpose, but that's a psik reisha. As I'm trying to do something that objectively is permissible, this action is doing a malacha. Or the modern day application, Pashut Pshat, would be opening the refrigerator when the light's on. That's a psik reisha. I'm opening the fridge, but I know it's turning on the light. That's not grama, because that's happening immediately. Grama is when there's a time delay. So in the case of the Mishnah, the whole thing is obviously very delayed. I'm not pouring water on the fire. I put water around the fire on the table. When the fire gets to the water, or when it gets to the kalim, it will be extinguished. So the maskan of the Gemara is both Rav Shimon ben Nanas and Rabbi Yossi agree that min haTorah, this is permissible. And it's based on the following drasha. The pasuk says, Lo sasa kol malacha. You shall not do any malacha on Shabbos. So we make the drasha, asiyahu de'aser, grama shari. It's only asiyas malacha that's aser. If you're doing a mice of malacha, that's what's aser. Grama, if it's indirect, if it's a time delay, then shari, right? Shari literally means it's mutter. Not even aser midirabanan, but it sounds like it's mutter and ganzen. It's totally permissible. And Rabbi Yossi agrees to that min haTorah. He just feels in a situation where there's a fire and a person's concerned about his property, adam bohul al mamono, you might lose yourself and come to put out the fire biyadayim. So he says midirabanan, it's going to be aser. But everyone agrees that midiraisa, it's mutter. Okay. Now the question is this limited to the malach of kibui? Right? One might say we know extinguishing is usually a little bit more mekel than other malachas on Shabbos. For what reason? Because it's not generally constructive. It's a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. We know, and we say this Mishnah every Friday night, so we know there's a machlokas, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, that if you're doing a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa, where I'm doing the exact same malacha the Torah says is aser, but I'm doing it for an entirely different reason. So Rabbi Yehuda says, you're still doing the malacha, and that's aser midiraisa. The classic case is you're digging a hole in your backyard, so you're accomplishing some form of plowing, you're getting your soil ready for planting, but I'm not doing it for that purpose. I'm doing it because I need dirt, right? The common need for dirt. As mine is that we don't need dirt as much, but in the olden days, it was actually a commodity for many different reasons. So I'm doing the maisa of choresh, but I'm doing it for a different purpose. Rabbi Yehuda says it's still asur midiraisa, and Reb Shimon says no, that's not asur midiraisa. It's a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa, and that's pater of al asur. That's asur midirabanan. How do we paskin with that? That's a machlokas rishonim, right? We know the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yehuda that a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa is asur min haTorah. However, Rov Rishonim seem to paskin like Reb Shimon, that a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa is going to be asur midirabanan. And the Pashib Pshat, although this itself is a machlokas, this seems to be how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. Okay, so you could argue maybe this is unique to kibui, because generally speaking, kibui is a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. The only time you have a malacha of kibui that would be asur according to everybody, including Reb Shimon, is if the kibui is accomplishing something, right? So by me putting out the fire, I'm making pachamim. I now have coals that I didn't have before. So I'm doing something constructive. But if I'm just doing kibui to get rid of the fire, that's a malacha she'ein tzricha legufa. So maybe you could argue the only time we say that grama is permissible is by the malacha of kibui. Now, how do we know that's not true? Because the drasha is not talking about kibui. The drasha we use to show that kibui in an indirect way would be mutter min haTorah is coming from a pasuk that's talking about all malacha. Lo sasa kol malacha, asiyahu de'aser, grama shari. So it's clear from the drasha, grama on any malacha will be mutter min haTorah. Okay. Now, do we assume it's ever asur midirabanan? Is it only mutter in this case because there's somewhat of a shasat chak? You don't want your table and your house to be destroyed. So what's interesting is that most Rishonim don't seem to qualify this leniency of grama, and they don't say that grama is only permitted b'makom hefsid. They seem to say, like the simple reading of the Gemara, grama's mutter. Now we do have a Mordechai. This is the top of page 3. The Mordechai at the bottom of this paragraph quotes from the Rabbeinu Yoel that the only reason why grama is mutter in the case of the Gemara, meaning it's mutter and there's not even a rabbinic restriction, is because we're talking about a makom hefsid. Meaning it's a situation of loss, and therefore Chazal were not going to impose any level of chumrah. But generally speaking, doing a malacha, even b'derech grama, just for fun, hey guys, look at this, right? I could do a malacha on Shabbos because I know how to orchestrate a grama situation. That would not be permissible. That's the ruling of the Mordechai. So how do we paskin the Maisa? Are we machmir like the Mordechai to only allow grama when it's makom hefsid? This seems to be a machlokus between the Mechaber and the Ramah. We take a look here at Shin Lamed Daled, Sif Chav Beis. So quoting our Mishnah, you have a table that catches on fire. You're allowed to place kli cheres meleyim mayim shevada yisbaku kishegi lehem hadleka. That will for sure crack and break when the fire gets to the kelim. Why is that mutter? Degram kibui mutter. So you see off the bat that the Mechaber is definitely paskening like Reb Shimon ben Nanas in contrast to Reb Yossi. Right? There's no restriction midirabanan. We're not concerned of adam bahul al mamona. You might come to do it directly. It's mutter because gram kibui is mutter. And then the Ramah writes two magic words. B'makom pseida. So the Ramah seems to be qualifying the Mechaber and saying it's only mutter b'makom pseida in a case of potential loss. So the Ramah, as you see from the parentheses, right? He's quoting the Mordechai. This is the Mordechai b'shem the Rabbeinu Yoel. The Ramah is definitely learning the Gemara that doing grama is only mutter on Shabbos when you're doing so to avoid a loss. So now here's the $64,000 question. Would the Mechaber agree to that stipulation? Would he agree to the Ramah that it's only b'makom pseida? Or would he say, like the Pashut Pshat and most Rishonim who never make this limitation on the Gemara, that grama's mutter on Shabbos even if there is no hefsid? What would you say? Meaning the Mechaber didn't limit it. So it would definitely seem like the Mechaber would say, even shelo b'makom hefsid, it should be mutter. I think that's the Pashut Pshat. What's one indication that if you were to ask the Ramah, did the Mechaber argue on you, that the Ramah might say, no, I assume he agrees? What's one indication to that?
You have a cabin that's on fire. What's the difference? What's on fire? Meaning, if it's not Makom Seder, so then it could just, there's a fire. You want it to go out. There's a fire in your stove. So put something around. It doesn't matter.
So it's a good point. Why do you choose a case of a Makom Hefsid? The answer, though, might be he's quoting the case of the Mishnah. That was the case of the Mishnah. Right? I think one slight indication would be if you were to ask what's that? The Ramah doesn't start off by saying V'yesh Omrim. Right? Generally speaking, we have a klal, and like any good rule, we have many exceptions to this klal. But we have a klal that when the Ramah starts off by saying V'yesh Omrim, he's indicating, I'm telling you another opinion in contrast to the Mechaber. Here he doesn't start off by saying, Yesh Omrim Dafka B'makom Pseida. It sounds like he's just qualifying the Mechaber, but only B'mkom Pseida. So that might be a slight indication that if you were to ask the Ramah, he would say, maybe the Mechaber agrees to me. So this is an interesting debate. I think the Pashut Pshat is the assumption is the Mechaber would say grama on Shabbos is mutter even if there's no hefsid because he doesn't mention that limitation, and the Ramah is being more machmir. That's the Pashut Pshat machlokus Mechaber Ramah. Okay. Now this heter of grama that according to the Mechaber would be true in all cases according to the Ramah only b'makom pseida. Would this leniency apply only in a case where it may or may not happen? I'm setting up something where in this case, right, the extinguishing might happen, it might not happen. Is that the only time we have the leniency of grama? Or is it talking about a situation where I'm setting up something where it will for sure happen? Let's say, for example, I'm setting a timer on Shabbos. Now, this is going to be a massive machlokus in contemporary poskim. We'll see between Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Rav Moshe. But if you were to take the approach that setting a timer on Shabbos, assuming I'm not using anything electrical, it's all manual. So what am I doing? I'm turning the thing where now the light will go on at 2 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. Changing. Not setting before Shabbos. On Shabbos itself, I'm realizing I want the lights to go on earlier than I had initially set up. I'm going to change it. So what I'm doing now is I'm setting up a situation where the lights are going to turn on, right, in 3 hours from now. Or I'm adjusting a timer where the lights are going to turn off 3 hours from now. If you were to view that as grama, which is debatable, but if you were to view that as grama, I'm setting up something that I'm not doing any melacha right now. There's definitely a time delay. So you could argue, though, that's for sure going to happen. Does the fact that it's for sure going to happen take away the leniency of grama? And the answer sounds like it's a resounding no, right? For a few different reasons. First of all, the language of the Machaber is afilu kli cheres chadoshim maleim mayim shevada yisbaku kishitagi lehem adleka. They will for sure break when the fire gets there, and then the water will extinguish the fire. Definitely sounds like we're talking about a situation where it's for sure going to happen. It's not a suffix. Furthermore, you take a look at the Bir Lacha. Right, the Bir Lacha here on this sif, he says, the first Bir Lacha, Shevada Yizbaku. She'ein lehem koach lakabel or mibnei shechadashim heim, because they're new kli cheres, they don't have the strength to hold that kind of heat. Umashma b'gemara da'afilu im mechavein lezeh. So the first thing the Bir Lacha says is it's clear from the Gemara that even if your intent is to put out the fire, that doesn't take away from the leniency of grama. That's the whole case of the Gemara. I'm trying to put out the fire. And he says, and this seems to be the Chafetz Chaim's own understanding of the drasha, he says from the very drasha itself, Lo sasa bo melacha, asiyahu da'asa grama shari, says the Chafetz Chaim, v'dumia da'asiya shrinan b'gemara. If we're saying that everything that's generally asr when you do it in a direct way is going to be mutter when you do it in an indirect way, so that means the same way it's asr to do malacha when you're intending for that malacha to happen, and it's for sure going to happen, it's asr min haTorah. So hu adin, if I'm intending for a malacha to happen, that's my kavana, and it's for sure going to take place, but I'm doing it b'derech grama, then that would be permissible. So from the Bir Lacha and from the simple reading of the Mechaber, you see that the leniency of grama applies even if that's my intent, and even if it's for sure going to happen. And we also see, like the Bir Lacha points out in the next small piece, that the leniency of grama is not limited to kibui, it applies to all 39 malachos. Okay. So now we have the excitement. Just to define our terminology, meleches machshavos. Mazeh. Meleches machshavos means intentional malacha. How do we define meleches machshavos? It's very difficult to have any good one-liner that incorporates all different examples. But generally what it means is that for malacha to be problematic on Shabbos, min haTorah, it requires me doing the malacha in the same way it's generally done, and for the same reason it's generally done. So, for example, according to Reb Shimon, who holds that a malacha shein tzricha lagufa, I'm doing the exact same action of the malacha, but I'm doing it for a different purpose. Why is that not asur min haTorah? Because it's lacking meleches machshavos. I might be doing the same thing, but I'm not doing it for the same tafkid, for the same goal. Or another example would be doing a malacha b'derech shinui. If I do it in an abnormal way, the reason why that's not Asr min HaTorah is that's not Melechas Machshavas. So Melechas Machshavas is usually a Chumrah or a Kula. It's usually a Kula, because what it's doing is it's limiting those times where you're actually in violation of an Isser D'Oraisa of Malacha. It has to be just like this. There's one exception in Shas, though, where we find that Melechas Machshavas is a Chumrah. And that's in Baba Kama Daf Samach. The Gemara in Baba Kama Daf Samach, this is about 7 lines from the top of the page. It quotes a brisa. Liba v'libsa haruach. The case is you're standing in your backyard and you have a fire on the barbecue and you're trying to fan it to go into your neighbor's yard. For what reason? Because I really don't like him, right? And I'm too much of a coward to do anything myself, but if my fire goes there and destroys his property, I wouldn't mind, okay? However, my fanning of the fire itself is not sufficient. It's only a combination of me fanning the fire, v'libsa haruach, and the fact there's also a nice natural wind taking the fire to his property. So if the combination of both brings my fire to his area and destroys his backyard, am I chayev or am I potter? Says the brisa, I'm potter. Why am I potter? Because it's grama. It's not my direct action. If it was my fanning that had enough force to bring the fire to his property and destroy his backyard, so that's my maisa, there's not a grama involved, I'd be chayev. But we have a klal gadol when it comes to damaging. Grama ben nezakin is potter. So here, because it wasn't only me, but there were other things in play, that's referred to as a grama, so I don't have to pay for any of the damage. The Gemara, though, has a question. There's a malacha we find by Shabbos that seems to be very similar to this case. What is that malacha? Zora, right? Zora is winnowing. Generally, when you translate a malacha like Zora, it doesn't help, right? It's winnowing. It's not losing, it's winnowing, right? So what does that mean? It means you have all of this chaff and kernel after the disha, after the threshing, and you want to do some form of separation. So you take all of it and you throw it up into the air as there's a nice ruach. And what happens is the wind blows away a lot of the chaff because it's much lighter, and then the grain and the kernels fall back down. That's one of the lamed tes malachos that's also midiraisa on Shabbos. So the Gemara has the question, 1 second, that's not your maisa. You're not blowing it. If you were blowing the chaff away from the kernels, you could say, that's me. But I'm just throwing it in the air, and it's the wind that's doing the malacha. So why is it when the wind's doing the damage, that's grama, and I'm potter, but when the wind's doing the malacha, then I'm responsible for that? So there are a few different answers the Gemara gives. The ikar answer, though, that we bring lemaisa is the last answer from Rav Ashi. This is about 3 lines before the Mishnah. Rav Ashi Amar, Ki amrinan zora v'ruach misaito. Why do we say that zora and Shabbos is aser? Hani mili le'enyan Shabbos. That's regarding Shabbos. De meleches machshavos asra Torah. Because Shabbos we have this special principle that meleches machshavos asra Torah. So generally we say meleches machshavos means it has to be done in a particular way, and if you're not doing it the normal way, you don't have the normal intent, you're not chayiv min haTorah. Here the Gemara is saying, because your machshava was to accomplish this separation of the chaff and the kernel, even though objectively what you're doing is a grama, it's not really your maisa, but meleches machshavos makes it into your maisa. If you take a look at Rashi, the way that Rashi explains this line of the Gemara, last Rashi before the Mishnah, meleches machshavos, niskaimo machshavto. Your intent was fulfilled. Denichale beruach mesayato. Because this is what you wanted. You wanted the wind to help you. You were channeling, you were harnessing the wind. So by Shabbos, you're chayiv meleches machshavos. Aval hacha, but by nezikin, grama ba'almahu v'grama b'nezakin potter. It's only a grama, it's indirect, grama b'nezakin potter. So here we have what seems to be an incredible chumrah, that meleches machshavos could take something that, objectively speaking, is not fully me. It's a grama. And therefore, I'm potter when it comes to the realm of damages. But meleches machshavos, if that's my intent, I'm utilizing some other force, then it makes it as if I'm doing it. And I'm chayiv, that's one of the 39 melachos in Shabbos. An incredible Gemara. Okay. Now, somebody asked me a contradiction between the Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Chaf and the Gemara in Baba Kama and Daf Samach. Arya, go for it.
You're setting up the barrels, and they're going to break, so then that's your intention. So then you're turning the grama into a Shabbos of Kibbutz.
Yes. That's right. Oh, so we're going to see. But you look at these two Gemaras at face value, there seems to be a very strong contradiction. The Gemara in Shabbos was saying, grama on Shabbos is mutter. Mamish mutter. And according to the Mechaber, he would probably say, you don't even need makom hefsid, asiyahu, the aser, grama shari. It's only your maisa that's a problem. If it's grama, totally mutter. And the Ramah would say, it's mutter, but makom hefsid. Okay, but the Gemara Bava Kama is telling us that if I'm doing a grama, but that's my intention, and I know it's going to happen, so meleches machshavos makes this indirect maisa, we view it as a direct maisa.
You put in the word groma there when you're describing the Gemara in Bava Kama.
It wasn't me, not my fault. It's
Did someone say the word groma here?
the Gemara, grama ba'almahu, but grama b'nezakin potter. Yeah. The Gemara is describing this as grama. So make up your mind. But according to Rav Ashi, the way that the Rishonim learn Rav Ashi is that what he's telling us is they're both grama. But on Shabbos, if that's your intention, it takes away the grama, and we view it as it's you, because Rashi says, niskaimo machshavto. And it's all about your machshava, meaning the simple reading of this Gemara seems to be saying, because we pay so close attention to what your intention is when it comes to Shabbos, then even something that objectively is indirect, we view it as this is your ma'aseh. Okay, everyone's jumping to answers. Can we just appreciate the question, relish in the question, Rabbi Light? Now it's interesting, amongst the Rishonim, who has this kasha? Nobody. So usually if in the Rishonim they're not asking us stira in Gemaras, that probably means we're missing something, right? The Rashba didn't address this, the Ritva didn't say anything, the Ramban has no comment. You know, there's no discussion in the Rishonim as to, hey, there's an incredible stira between Bava Kama Daf Samach and Shabbos Kuf Chaf. So we're probably missing something. However, it's a valid question, and we do find the great Acharonim who addressed this stira. Okay. Let's take a look at the Rush for a moment. Now, the Rush is not addressing any contradiction, but he does seem to have a different understanding of the Gemara in Bava Kama. And it could very well be, based on his understanding, that's why none of the Rishonim had the contradiction. Because according to the Rush, there's not much of a stira. What does the Rush say? This is page 5. Let's jump to the middle. V'lo amrina an alfa pi shesayeh ruach b'asiyah se'esh havi ki'ilu hu aso levado midi dehavi azor v'ruach mesaito dechashvina an le ki'ilu asa malacha levado dehasa meleches machshavos asra Torah. Okay, by Shabbos we have a special principle, meleches machshavos. Afal pi de lo have ele grama ba'alma, which means even though it's only grama, objectively speaking, Bahachi chayv Torah. But the Torah is telling you, you're chayv on this. Kiven de malacha zu ikar asiyasa al yedei ruach. Because this malacha, the way you do it, is through utilizing the wind. Aval hacha, but by damaging grama ba'alma v'grama b'nezakin pater. That's indirect. And anything that's indirect, when it comes to damaging, you're pater. So the Rush seems to be learning the Gemara slightly different, or maybe radically different than Rashi. Rashi says, Meleches machsheves asra Torah. The reason why you're chayiv by the case of Zora is because, yeah, it's a grama, but your intention was to accomplish this, and therefore we view it as a real direct maisa. The Rush seems to be saying something else. The Rush is saying, Meleches machsheves asra Torah, that just means HaKadosh Baruch Hu said there are 39 malachas you can't do on Shabbos. Unfortunately, one of those malachas, it's called Zorah. But what do you mean? It's only a grama. True, correct. It is a grama. But Hashem said, this is Asur on Shabbos. Why? Because this is the 39 forms of creation that was used in the Mishkan. And those 39 forms of creation are Asur on Shabbos. Grama, who cares? This is what the malach is. And Hashem said it's Asur. So if you learn the Gemara like the Rush, there's really not much of a contradiction. The Gemara in Shabbos is talking about a case of kibui or any other malacha where this is not the way you do the malacha. The way you put out a fire is by throwing water onto the fire. Right? The way you light a fire is by lighting a match. You could argue, assuming a timer would be grama, which again, we're not going to walk away this morning thinking a timer is actually grama, but if you were to take that approach conceptually, you would say, that should be fine on Shabbos. According to the Mechaber, in all cases, according to the Ramah, maybe only b'makom hefsid, but that's not the way you generally do it. That's not the definition of turning on a light or turning off a light. When it comes to the malach of Zorah, of course it's a grama, but Hashem said that grama is asur. Question, doctor.
So if I build a Rube Goldberg machine, that's going to...
If you build a what?
A Rube Goldberg machine. You know, like you have a bunch of things, this thing is connected to that thing, and it's this long, it's all mechanical. And at the end of the day, the seed, the mixture of seed and chaff gets released from a high height on Shabbos, and when it gets winnowed, that's okay?
So this is a wonderful question. If I build a special device that works b'derech grama, does that mean therefore it's mutter? Because, well, that's how this device works. Okay. And the truth is, this gets involved with, we have, the Star K Yontif oven that we'll be addressing in Hashem. We have institutions in Eretz Yisrael, right? The Tzomet Institute that specialize in creating devices using a system of grama. Now, often it's really meant for hospital settings and cases of at least Safek Pikuach Nefesh, but this is, or the Shabbos scooter, right? The Star K has a special hechsher on a Shabbos scooter using some form of grama. So all of these types of things really are part of our shaila. Now, this all goes back to a machlokes, the Evan HaOzer and the Magen Avram. All right, I wanted to share with you what this machlokes is, and we'll see how it ties into the machlokes between Rashi and the Rush. And then we might stop there for today. So in the olden days meaning in biblical times, or in the times of Chumash, the way you would do tochein, for example. What's tochein, right? You're threshing, you're grinding. That was a prior process to Zorah, is you would trample on the chita, on the tavua. Huh? Disha. You don't have to be so exact, whatever. Tochein, dash, whatever. They're all within the 11 Siddur de Pas. Okay. Call it dash, fine. Dash is trampling, okay. Now, you would either do it yourself, you might have your animals do it, you would lead your animals. However, in modern times, meaning hundreds of years ago, but further up in history than the times of Chumash, they had something called the Rechaim Shel Mayim. And it bedafka rhymes, if you notice that, right? Rechaim Shel Mayim means a watermill. So this was utilizing the force of running water before indoor plumbing, but basically you would set up some kind of rechaim, having the force of water come, that turns the rechaim to keep on chopping up all of the tavua that you're placing inside that machine. Okay, so there's a shaila, Even HaOzer and the Magen Avram. Even HaOzer writes, let's start with the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram says that on Shabbos, you'd be allowed to take grain and place it inside of this Rechaim Shel Mayim. Why? Because it's a grama. I'm not doing any form of dash. What's happening? The machine's doing it. I'm putting it in the machine and it's grinding it up.
This is on Shabbos you're putting it in?
On Shabbos Kodesh. Take a look here at the beginning of number 6. This is the Bir Lach and Reish Nun Beis.
That's the way the malacha is done.
So the malacha originally wasn't done with a Rechaim Shel Mayim. It was always done with a Rechaim Shel Yod.
But now this is the way the malacha is done.
Oh, so this is going to be the question, right? If this is normal practice now, living in the 13th century, does that change anything?
Right. They don't do it the other way anymore.
Okay, so that's going to be part of this question. This form of tochein, this form of whatever you're doing, is that going to be usher because this is the way it's done now? Or might you say this is not the way it was initially done? So take a look at the Magen Avram. Shemitzadei lomar denesinas chitim letoch rechaim shamayim b'Shabbos leika chiyuv chatos. If you place the tavua inside of this special water mill on Shabbos, you're not in violation of Mitzvah Deraisa. The techina acher kach memela asi. Because the tochen that happens afterwards is memela. I'm not doing the action of chopping it up. Vehevi raya lezeh b'tosfos. Fine. So the Magen Avram says this should be mutter. Now, what Gemara would convince the Magen Avram to feel Rechaim Shel Mayim is mutter? The Gemara in Shabbos and Daf Kuf Chaf. The Gemara says anything that's a grama is mutter. So maybe it's only mutter min haTorah. Maybe he would agree to the Mordechai that it's only mamish mutter if there's a hefsid. But at least min haTorah, there should not be a problem of tochen because it's grama. That's the Magen Avram. Well, no, not yet. 1 second. Let me just spell out the other tzad. You thought if you were wearing the talis today, I'd be more intimidated. But I'm not. B'chol achronim dachu rayaso. But all of the achronim argue on the Magen Avram. Namely, right, the Even HaOzer is the most famous. The Even HaOzer says, by you placing that tavua in the Rechaim Shel Mayim, you are in violation of Tochein Mamish. Why? Because this is the derech of doing Tochein. It almost sounds like, well, the Magen Avram was quoting the Gemara in Shabbos on Daf Kuf Chaf that Gram is mutter. And the Even HaOzer is coming along and saying, but there's a Gemara in Baba Kama on Daf Samach that says, in Maleches Machshavos Asra Torah, if you're doing something, and it's not just a random, arbitrary, I'm putting the water on the table and the fire is going to get here, but this is the derech. This is the way this whole machine works. You can't take out the card of grama. There's no grama leniency here because this is how the malacha is done. So one way of saying it over is it's almost like the Magen Avram is in the world of Shabbos Kuf Chaf, forgetting about the Gemara in Baba Kama, and the Even HaOzer is saying, I know the Gemara in Baba Kama, and therefore the Gemara in Shabbos wouldn't apply. Another way of saying it would be, it almost sounds like the Even Ozer and the Magen Avram are having the same or a similar machlokus that Rashi and the Rosh had. Meaning that according to Rashi, who says, Malachas machshavas asra Torah, it's not unique to a particular malacha that's always done in an indirect way, like Zorah. But anytime you're doing grama, where you're trying to make something happen and it's actually happening, Malachas machshavas makes it that that's your malacha. So the Even Ozer would be very much in line with Rashi. You're doing a malacha. This is the way it's done, at least nowadays. So you should be responsible. That's considered your maisa. The Magen Avram seems to be very well lined up with the Rosh. The Magen Avram would say, no, Zorah is something special. That's what the malacha is. Originally speaking, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, even though it's indirect, you're still chayiv for this. It's one of the Lamed Tes malachos. But something like Tochein, that wasn't the definition of Tochein. It happens to be you invented some kind of modern technology that you could do Tochein through grama. Okay. But Lemaisa, that's not the malacha. So it almost sounds like we have a machlokus Rashi and the Rosh amongst the Rishonim, and amongst the Achronim we have a machlokus between the Even Ozer and the Magen Avram. According to the Rosh and the Magen Avram, things seem to be pretty smooth. Grama is the klal, and the Gemara in Baba Kama is the exception. Grama is always mutter on Shabbos, at least min Torah, and it's only the malacha of Zorah, or maybe you could argue Zoreya, planting is also by definition a grama. Maybe bishul is in that category. Maybe trapping, maybe there's 4 malachas that you would look at and say, those malachas are by definition grama and they're still aser. But generally speaking, everything else, grama is no problem. That's the world of the Rosh. In the world of Rashi, and what the Even Ozer seems to be saying, we really have to find a more nuanced understanding of how do you differentiate between the chumrah Baba Kama and the kula of Shabbos, right? Am I making sense?
The Gemara's are arguing.
The Achronim don't seem to be happy with that. Stam Gemara in 2 places we assume to be miyashev.
So according to the Rosh, the only way that you could be chayev the malacha is if you do it the way that it was done 4,000 years ago.
So at least one understanding of the Rosh is that you have to do the malacha the same way it was done in the times of the Mishkan, and even if you have modern technology, that now you can do it in a different way, and it's grama, okay. But if it's grama be'etzim, then it's always going to be aser. That's what the Rosh seems to say. So what I want to do is I want to share with you the basic approach of Rabbi Chaim Ozer. We're going to call it a day. Rabbi Chaim Ozer says an idea to really explain Rashi and the Even Ozer, where he says that it could very well be, there are many cases where if your intent is to accomplish something, there's no leniency of grama. Those cases are when you have something that this is very much the norm. This is how it's done. It's not arbitrary, it's not abnormal. The way it's done, lav dafka in the times of the Mishkan, but even if it's the way it's done, bisman hazeh, I don't care if there's some kind of time delay. If you're creating things that the brechaim shel mayim, this is the way the water mill works, but it's a common way of doing tochein, you don't have the leniency of grama. Grama means it's ba b'mikra, which means it's somewhat arbitrary. Then we could view it as it's not really me, it's not my maisa. Anytime I'm using a machine that's made to operate in a particular way, even if there is an inherent time delay, there's no leniency of grama. So in the case in the Gemara in Shabbos where you're putting water around the table, that's not the way you extinguish flames. So then we say that's not you. You're not directly connected to a maisa of kibui. That's grama. Grama is mutter min haTorah. When it comes to the case of Shabbos, to Baba Kama, it's not limited. In Rashi's world, it's not limited to Zorah. It could be any malacha in the world, but if nowadays it's very common to have machines that do this malacha, even if it's being done in something that has a time delay system, but this is the derech, it's not Baba Mikra, and there's no heter of grama. That's what the Gemara in Baba Kama is saying. This is the distinction of Reb Chaim Ozer. Now it comes out according to this, right? And this is what we're going to get into next time in Mirz Hashem, is we could really call into question the whole idea of creating a grama device might be flawed inherently. If this is the way the thing works, it's built in this fashion to have a time delay, so then maybe you could argue you no longer have the leniency of a time delay. This becomes the same thing as a Rechaim Shalmayim. Okay, we're going to stop here. Have a wonderful day, Rabbosai. Huh?
That's really costing like Rosh